So my name is Lena. I'm the Marketing and Publicity Director here at Politics and Prose, and I'm really pleased to welcome you, whether it's your first time or one of many. We've been lucky enough to be here 30 years, and that's due to your support. So come often, buy a book you love, perhaps this book today, and come again. Today we are honored to host Kerry Howley, whose work has appeared in Harper's, the Paris Review, the New York Times Magazine, Atlantic Monthly, the Wall Street Journal, and Slate, to name just a few of the publications. She's here today with Throne, which follows the lives of two cage fighters, one starting the promising and brutal career, and the other more on the sort of aging end. And I have to say, the narrative voice of the book that's describing their lives is, and this is really no small feat considering what their lives are, is really as fascinating as the portraits themselves. And reviewers have very much agreed with that. Time Magazine's reviewer praised it as the most bizarre and fascinating book I've read this year. The precision of Howley's prose reminds me of Joan Didion or David Foster Wallace. She's so involved with the fight as if she's trying to eat it with words. Howley writes like someone who's been flayed, all nerve endings exposed, no barriers between her and the world around her. And our own Washington Post agreed it's as dark and as funny as anything I've read this year. So please help me welcome Kerry Howley to PNP.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It's really great to be here at Politics and Prose. I lived in D.C. for a long time, and in some sense, D.C. is the city I left to be able to write Throne. It's really wonderful to be back. So Throne is a book that involves my following around a few cage fighters, UFC fighters, mixed martial artists, whatever you want to call them, for a couple of years. And everything that has to do with their world, with martial arts, with fighting, is completely factual. But it's told through the voice of a fictional narrator named Kit, who is, she's very excitable and very academic and a little bit naive. So that's just a little bit of setup. And in the part that I'm going to read today, she has just met one of the fighters, the more conventionally successful fighters, who's named Eric Koch. And he's about to become a very big deal. He's already a big deal in Iowa. And she has been invited to hang out with his fight team. A fight team is kind of a weird thing. It's like a bunch of fighters who train together and would never fight one another. And she's been invited to Friday Night at Rocky's house, which is this kind of legendary thing among Cedar Rapids fighters. And nobody really knows what happens Friday nights at Rocky's house except the fighters who are invited. So Kit has no idea what's about to happen. Is it going to be some strange fighting ritual? And you should know that it's a comic work. And I guess that's about it. So I will just start. The reason I am so good, Eric said later that night, when 8 of us were together seated in Rocky's basement, is because I'm crazy. I don't have a job. I don't have any way of making money. I just decided to train 6 or 7 hours a day. As Eric spoke, he kicked at a standing bag that shot out of Rocky's floor. Most people won't do that, Eric said. Thwap. They're like, you need a backup plan. You need something to fall back on. But if I have a backup plan, then it's easy for me to back out. Thwap. My parents are like, go to school. Well, if I go to school, maybe I'll be like, well, I'm going to do this instead, playing it safe. I won't do that. So maybe, thwap, I'll end up in the gutter. I'll take that chance. Rocky and Eric kept their distance from intoxicating substances, but the rest of the men were passing around a rolled stick of cannabis, of which I partook solely in the interest of behavioral camouflage. The conversation turned to a legendary fighter named Mauricio Hua, popularly known as Shogun. Lonnie is obsessed with Shogun, said Rocky. Lonnie thinks Shogun could beat Jesus. No, said Lonnie. What I said was, if anybody could beat Jesus, it would be Shogun. Jesus didn't exist, said Rob on an exhale. I was watching this thing on the History Channel. They don't have any evidence. Come on, said Rocky, the group's only believer. They don't even have... They got shit, said Rocky. Records and stuff. What movie should we watch? Keone asked, more out of a sense of ceremony than anything else, because there was only one movie they watched on Friday nights. Pumping Iron, Eric said. thwap. We filed upstairs to collapse on the sofa, the floor, a long fuzzy couch. Eric lay in a recliner, legs hanging over the side. The bottom half of Eric's HD tattoo was visible from under his t-shirt sleeve. Damien's peeked out from the hem of his shorts. Jared slid in the VHS tape, which hummed until something clicked and Schwarzenegger popped on screen. Can we smoke up here? Asked Jared, who had a serious stutter only cannabis cured. No, just downstairs, said Rocky. Have you tried blueberry muffin tops? Asked Keone of Damien, passing over the box. No. You haven't lived. Arnold Schwarzenegger and his competitors stood on stage and transformed themselves into Greek statuary turned steroidal. They stared into the distance and pushed out sinew, swollen balloons of muscle choking on the body's fibrous webbing. Tendons popped thick as electrical cord. Schwarzenegger looked as though he had been skinned and painted orange. Let's say you train your biceps, Schwarzenegger said in everyone's favorite scene. Blood is rushing into your muscles, and that's what we call the pump. De pump, Eric said. That's what we call de pump, Keone said. Your muscles, said Schwarzenegger, looking straight into the camera, get a really tight feeling, like your skin is going to explode any minute. And it's really tight, and it's like someone is blowing air into your muscle, and it just blows up, and it feels different. It feels fantastic. It's as satisfying to me as coming is. You know, as if in having sex with a woman and coming. Eric laughed, doubled over. So can you believe how much I am in heaven, continued Schwarzenegger. I'm like getting the feeling of coming in the gym. I'm getting the feeling of coming at home. I'm getting the feeling of coming backstage. When I pump up, when I pose out in front of 5,000 people, I get the same feeling. So I'm coming day and night. It's terrific, right? Eric laughed so hard he spilled his Gatorade. The men had watched the scene dozens, perhaps hundreds of times. Rocky rewound it, and they watched it again. On that couch, surrounded by those men, a strange warmth radiated through me. Rarely have I seen a group of people so comfortable with one another, so easily intimate. They would be laughing that entire night, leaning into one another, sharing muffin tops and trading movie lines. It is with only slight embarrassment that I admit how I ached to be more securely among them, to share with a dozen people the same tattoo, the same stories, the same hot, sweaty days, engaged in some physical endeavor. They even shared a similar build, though some were black, and some brown, and some, like Eric, blindingly white. With the exception of Rocky, no one was noticeably muscled, because Schwarzeneggerian muscle was worse than useless in an actual fight. It starved the rest of the body of oxygen. No one in the room looked particularly like a fighter either. No broken noses, no flat faces, few mat-gnarled ears, and least of all lanky, long-necked Eric. In jeans, alone, in a bar, each would be just a boy too small for football. Are you coming with us to Adventureland tomorrow? Rocky asked Eric after the second viewing. Rocky and Eric spent their few hours away from the gym, alternating between trips to the casino and trips to the amusement park. No, Eric said. I'll be in Milwaukee by then. Here was the evening's only uncomfortable moment, a slight tightening, a collective intake of stale air. I began to realize that Eric's talk of leaving was a source of great frustration to these men, who considered Eric theirs. If he stayed in Cedar Rapids, remained theirs, he would remain but a novice fighter making absurd, untested claims about his capacity to face Jose Aldo. The silence between Eric and Rocky lingered. Eric was on his feet and shadowboxing again. Steve ordered a pizza covered in ground beef and cream cheese, then collected money from everyone but Eric, who started talking about shadows posturing at a bar in Iowa City. The other day, Wes and I were at Union, he told everyone, and Wes was talking to this girl, and these guys came and interrupted, talking about how they're fighters who train with Eric Koch, yada, yada, yada. Of course, said Damien as he was taking a slice of pizza, lifting it up high above his mouth so as to catch swinging strands of hanging cheese. So West came and got me and was like, hey, these guys say they train with you. So I go up there, and what happens when I show up? Never seen them in my life. They're like, oh my God, Eric Koch, you're awesome, yada, yada, yada. That shit is offensive to me. I got nut riders everywhere, people I don't want on my nuts. I cannot say I often saw these nut riders myself, because these men so rarely ventured out in public, and when they did, as to a bar, they did so as a single covey clearly uninterested in mingling with lesser members of lighter flocks. Much more likely was it that I would find myself with 2 or 3 of them, preparing for a fight, as I did the next day, squeezed between Rob and Eric as we drove in Lonnie's truck to a place Eric knew. Our knees touched as we knocked along. It was 2 weeks before the fight. Lonnie and Rob were hungry and miserable, and mostly they spoke of how much more hungry and miserable they would become. "Look at my abs," said Lonnie, pulling up his shirt on abs turned flat by denial. "I hate my abs. My abs mean my life sucks." "I'm going to be so angry by July 14, said Rob. "If you want to be around a Debbie Downer, hang around me." Eric pointed to a field by the highway in the shadow of the backside of a billboard, and Lonnie pulled the company pickup onto the grass, leaving tracks in soil made soft from yesterday's rain. When Rob and Lonnie fought, Eric would be there. All of Hard Drive would be there, for every fighter came to every HD fight in driving distance, crowded the locker room, walked as a fist-pumping entourage to the cage door. And none of them would ever, under any circumstances, fight one another. To seek that kind of penetrative intimacy with one's brothers would be to commit a crime as old as crime itself. Thus Hard Drive fought Militich, and Militich, but never Hard Drive. There were also the Catholic boys in Dubuque and the Thai Dam in Des Moines, descendants of refugees from Vietnam. The Thai Dam would stage the fights Lonnie and Rob had coming to them in a West Des Moines dance hall. Now, while every Saturday night brings staged encounters to every American county, coast to coast, and most especially in the soft prairie middle, the fights of which conventionally minded fighters dream are not those in West Des Moines dance halls, but those staged in big cities and broadcast on pay-per-view. Much as we might hope for the fighter's dream to remain clean and pure, it will in fact be driven by the exigencies of cable television. One may start, as did Eric, with an encounter in a Cedar Rapids convention center, but one does so in the hopes that some guardian angel is waiting, someone who will pluck you from your obscurity. This is what Duke had done for Eric. And at that point, unless you are stuck as Eric is stuck, you will kiss your mother goodbye and move, as fighterly men once moved to Davenport, to one of 3 currently ascendant camps in Albuquerque, Miami, and Milwaukee, from which you will ascend to the big shows. Then, provided you are conventionally minded, you will dream of your title shot, of the day when they deem you fit to challenge the fighter of highest status. Even Lonnie and Rob dreamed of this, though Lonnie would continue to be a house painter, and Rob a paralegal, and both would lose their fights against the Thai Dam, at which point they would turn, as they always did, to Keone, who would know just what to say. Of course, even as we dream, we know there are dreams beyond our capacities, and the fighters of Hard Drive, being especially intellectual men Keone handpicked, tended to see more clearly than most. Rob was a single father who drove a full hour back and forth to Valhalla every weekday after work. Nothing came naturally to him, and no one would ever suggest he ought to be fighting in venues bigger than the Cedar Rapids Convention Center. What he had in Hard Drive was the right to tell anyone that his best friend and coach was the fighter Eric Koch, that when he fought, Eric Koch was in his corner, that when he lost, Eric Koch would help him rebuild for the next time. Eric pulled the kettlebells from the back of the truck. He stood in between Rob and Lonnie against the sun and took a big step, pushing the weight behind his stretched body, before bringing his arm forward as his hip turned in time, and the bell flew 50 feet over the grass before it rolled and landed on a tilt, like a planet. He ran to the weight, picked it up, launched it again. Rob tried to do the same with his weight, lift, swing, hurl, but let it go slightly too late. Lonnie released too early. Both of their weights slopped into the grass. "His doesn't sink," said Rob as he jogged left. "Yeah, it just like rolls," said Lonnie, breathing hard. Rob and Lonnie crisscrossed the field, veering left and right, while Eric cut a perfect landing strip straight through the grass. I cannot tell you exactly when it was that the uneasiness began to manifest within me, but this was about the time I noticed that something I had taken for granted in Sean was here, in Hard Drive, lacking. Sean projected an aura of sustained bewilderment. He was willing to be lost and alone. I could sense no such bewilderment in Eric, no such courage. One had to be ready to receive the octagon, were it ever to show up. And Eric did not seem ready to receive. So safely was he sewn into the fabric of hard drive, so apparently unwilling was he to bear the wound of leaving home. What I am trying to say is that I was certain in the summer of 2010 that Eric Koch was a thing of great and rare beauty, and not at all certain that he was, at heart, a fighter. And so instead of trying to keep him in Cedar Rapids, as hard drive would, I began to root for him to break free. Thank you. Are there any questions about craft or the fighters? Yes, one?
Could you use a microphone, please?
Oh.
Sorry.
That was really, really good. I just was curious, and it's such a male-dominated kind of world and way of thinking. Was there any challenge that you had in accessing that world and learning about it and then translating it into the book?
Yeah, I think that being a woman actually made things a lot easier, and that I just wasn't engaged in a lot of the status competitions that that tend to preoccupy men who write about fighting. Not all men, but a lot of fighting books are about like trying to win the approval of the legendary fight coach, or struggling with your own masculinity. And since I was not comparing myself in terms of masculinity to the fighters, I think our relations were easier. And it was also a way to be invisible, because it was always assumed when I was at a fight that I was someone's wife and girlfriend or sister. And so it was kind of like people would see past me, and that makes it a lot easier to report when you walk up to something and you're not changing the dynamic. So for the most part, I was just really grateful that that I could kind of disappear.
I'll ask a question. What did you learn about yourself in writing this book? Not just necessarily putting yourself in this very strange world, but also just from writing this book itself and completing and publishing process.
Well, I can tell you that I really enjoyed hanging out with the fighters, and I think part of that was the fun of being around people who were really open to experience, people who are kind of consciously nonconformist, who, as I say in that chapter, are not the guys who would go out for football and basketball, who want to do the taboo thing. I also learned that I'm very bad at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which takes a kind of memory that I think dancers have, which involves learning very long chains of movement. But also that it's really nice to just kind of like roll on the ground with a bunch of other people. And I would continue to take jiu-jitsu lessons if I weren't completely humiliatingly bad at it. But I very much see the appeal of people who do it as a hobby.
I'm sure you get asked this a lot, but how did you come to this world, and how did you decide to write about it?
I think I probably just first encountered MMA on TV like everybody else. It was the reality show attached to the UFC that kind of brought it into the mainstream, into like middle class households, and I think that's probably how I first encountered it. But I can remember at the first fight I was at being so interested in the way a moment in a fight, a really brutal moment in a fight, a moment of release, after one of those really boring moments, which like one of my friends calls MMA the sport with the hugging. So there's like hugging, and then there's this release and this moment that seems like absolute savagery and totally outside of civilization. But what makes that possible is this combination of incredibly refined martial arts that take decades of practice. And so I was interested in exploring how this process of refinement can lead to these moments outside of civilization. And I was living in Iowa, which is a state that has a lot of MMA activity because it's a big wrestling state. So you have all these guys who are really talented wrestlers, and what do you do with that when you graduate from high school? You're not going to go join the WWE because that's not real. So there's all this talent. And I think I liked about it that it wasn't like I could Google local MMA fight. Like I had to know the guy who knew about the sketchy fight in the strip club in Cedar Rapids, and that was kind of fun, like finding the extra legal stuff. And then it just kind of went from there for a very long time.
How did you ever get a sense of how the sport and that world changed since the sort of reality show in the UFC came to cable television?
I don't know about that, but I do know that when the UFC started, it was kind of billed as like no holds barred, which was never the case. But they initially marketed it as being just the kind of brutal savagery people think it is. And then that got regulators' attention, so they had to shift from that marketing strategy. But there was a learning process. They had to figure out that they had to tell the fighters that you couldn't pull someone's hair or bend their finger back or kick them when they were down. And there have also been, one of the interesting things about following the sport for a long time is that people start to catch up to one another. So there was a period when the guy who would win was always the guy with the best Brazilian jiu-jitsu, who had the moves. And then people started to catch up, and then it was the best. There was a period where there was a lot of like not very good boxing. And so as people started to learn to transition more gracefully between the different arts, there were these very different phases in the sport.
Hi, Ms. Howley. Thank you for coming. I have to say, this book is so good. It's like reading a book for the first time. I read about it on a Reddit forum, actually.
Oh,
People
wow.
just were just kind of amazed that it kind of came to fruition. So if anyone doesn't have a copy yet, I'm not being paid. This is an awesome book.
Thank you.
So your introduction into the sport seems to be you know, we would come out of this academic conference and you see Sean Huffman pinned down. Do you think it was something about Sean's kind of defeat that night that really kind of was an attractive moment for you, or was it just witnessing it live for the first time? And my second question is, WWE is not real? What are you saying?
Sorry. Well, actually, I should make clear that it was Kit that I was at that phenomenology conference. That was not that didn't actually happen. But I thought a lot of. I mean, Sean lost that fight, and it was the fight where I just thought, I have to meet this person. I have to meet Sean Huffman. I think I'd already decided that I was interested in mixed martial arts and wanted to write about it before that fight. But there was something so beautiful about his ecstasy in losing, about how it didn't feel like a loss at all, that just made me feel like I need to find and hang out with this person. And I don't always have the best instincts, but that was a really good instinct because he is quite the character. And he's just this guy who he can never get it together. He's always overweight for the fight. He's always losing, but there's so much. He's also everyone's favorite fighter for the reasons that I was saying before. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's what happened then. Hi.
Hey, there's the how did you get into this, but there's the why did you get into this? And I take it this narrative is at a high level structure an encounter between two worlds. Mm-hmm. It's an intellectualization of fighting, and it's a sort of bringing down to earth of the intellectual world.
Yeah.
What are you trying to accomplish with that?
Well, it was the poet Joe Wenderoth who first pointed out to me the comparison between MMA and Artaud's Theater of Cruelty, which is it's very profound in a way. I mean, if you reread that essay, those two essays by Artaud, it just sounds like MMA. But that's also completely absurd. So I wanted a way to talk about that without writing a kind of self-serious philosophical treatise on MMA. And I felt like the way to do that was to have this kind of comic, naive, over-intellectualized, analytical character hang out with these very chill, casual fighters and just see what emerged. So that's kind of the genesis of the high-low aspect of the book. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much again.